All right, buckle up for a deep dive into a case that had everyone wondering, was she a victim or was she a mastermind? We're talking about Sherri Papini, the woman who went from America's damsel in distress to, uh, well, something much less sympathetic.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that really walks the line between vulnerability and manipulation. You see this picture perfect wife and mother who vanishes, and everyone fears the worst. But then as you peel back the layers, those fears give way to something else entirely.
Yeah, no kidding. And we've got a ton of sources lined up today, news articles that cover the entire saga, court documents with all the legal twists and turns, even a Hulu documentary called Perfect Wife, the mysterious disappearance of Sherri Papini.
Mm.
We'll even touch on a weird Eminem reference that adds a whole other dimension to this story.
Right, so we're going to lay out the timeline, the evidence that eventually unraveled her story, and try to figure out what could drive someone to pull off such a crazy hoax.
So imagine this. November 2016, a quiet town in Northern California filer. Sherri Papini, a wife and mom of 2 young kids, goes out for a jog, leaves her phone and earbuds behind, and then gone. Just like that.
Yeah, her husband, Keith Papini, reported her missing when she didn't pick up their kids from daycare, and they found her stuff scattered near a jogging path, which just made things even more mysterious and scary.
This case blew up nationally. Almost overnight, everyone was on edge, desperate for answers. And then 3 weeks later, on Thanksgiving Day of all days, there's a huge twist. Sherri reappears 150 miles away, bruised, bound, and with a crazy story to tell.
She claimed she was kidnapped at gunpoint by 2 Hispanic women held captive and even branded. It was the kind of story that just grabbed everyone, feeding into our deepest fears about random violence and women being vulnerable.
And the media. They went into overdrive. You couldn't escape the headlines. Her husband giving interviews, crying, begging for her safe return, volunteers, searching everywhere, donations just pouring in. It was intense.
Yeah. There was even a mystery donor offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. It felt like the whole country was waiting and hoping for a happy ending.
And there's this other detail that's just strange. There was this mention of the book Gone Girl, which is all about a wife who fakes her own disappearance. It popped up during the investigation, and it makes you wonder, was it just a coincidence or something more?
It's definitely a detail that takes on a new meaning as the case unfolds. You start to question if life was imitating art in a really messed up way.
The investigation was huge. I mean, they went all out. But as time went on, cracks started appearing in Sherri's story. This investigation went on for 6 years. 6 long years. They dug up a lot.
Oh, yeah. And the real turning point came when they found male DNA on Sherri's clothes. It didn't match her husband, and it led investigators down a path that would unravel the whole thing.
They traced that DNA back to an ex-boyfriend of Sherri's, a guy named James Reyes. And what he told them, well, it sent shockwaves through the entire case. So this ex-boyfriend, James Reyes, he just drops this bomb. He admits that Sherri was with him the whole time she was supposedly kidnapped.
Yeah, Reyes claimed that he was manipulated by Sherri. She told him this story about her abusive marriage and convinced him to help her fake the whole thing. They even went as far as hurting her to make it look like she had been through something really terrible.
And the evidence all points to Reyes being right. Phone records, rental car receipts, eyewitness accounts, none of it matched what Sherri was saying.
It's crazy. This story that started out about a scared victim turns into something way darker. It's suddenly a story about a woman who was lying and manipulating, not just fooling everyone around her, but also taking advantage of people's fears and empathy all across the country.
I know, right? Talk about a plot twist. It's like everyone is hanging on the edge of their seats,
Yeah.
and then it takes this crazy turn. It really makes you wonder how well you can ever really know anyone.
It does. And the question everyone wants to know is why? Why would anyone go through all that to make up such a dangerous and messed up story?
Exactly. Was she desperate to get out of a bad marriage? Was it a cry for help? Or was it something totally different, like wanting to be famous or get attention and sympathy?
Well, the Hulu documentary Perfect Wife tries to figure that out. They talk to experts who think she might have a personality disorder that makes her want attention and sympathy. Others think maybe her marriage was really bad and she just wanted to escape.
It's interesting that the documentary was Hulu's most watched documentary ever, which shows just how much people were fascinated by this case. It's like we're all drawn to these stories of lies and deception, this peek into the dark side of human nature.
I think you're right. This case hit on a lot of our anxieties about safety, feeling vulnerable, and how powerful misinformation can be. It showed how a good story can make people believe anything, especially when it plays on our emotions.
Yeah, for sure. So the truth comes out and it hits hard. Sherri Papini is arrested in March 2022, and she ends up pleading guilty to mail fraud and lying to federal agents.
Right, and she's sentenced to 18 months in prison, but she only serves 10, followed by time in a halfway house. On top of that, she's ordered to pay over $300,000 in restitution for wasting resources during the investigation and for the money she got from victim compensation funds.
And get this, she hasn't paid back any of that money. Not a single cent.
Wow. It really makes you think, are the consequences for lying like that strong enough? I mean, not just the financial cost, but the damage to people's trust and the impact on real kidnapping victims who might face more suspicion and doubt because of cases like this?
It's a mess. And the impact on her family was terrible. Her husband Keith filed for divorce and got full custody of their 2 kids.
And the people in Redding, California, where the Papinis lived, were devastated. They did everything they could to find Sherri, giving their time, money, and emotional support. To find out they were tricked like that, it was a huge betrayal.
And there's this other detail I just can't get over. Sherri was working on 2 children's books. She even told her daughter she was starting a foundation to help people.
It's almost like she's trying to change her story even after getting caught. It shows a level of denial, maybe even a need to keep manipulating how people see her.
What about the ex-boyfriend James Reyes? What happened to him after all this?
He worked with the investigators and didn't end up facing any charges. He says Sherri tricked him that he believed her about the abusive marriage. It's hard to know for sure, but he definitely got tangled up in a web of lies that had big consequences.
Speaking of getting tangled up, think about someone like Trudy Nickens. She started this volunteer search group called NorCal Alliance for the Missing, and she dedicated herself to finding Sherri. Can you imagine how she felt?
It's so sad. Here's someone who spends her life helping others trying to find missing people, and then she puts her heart and soul into this case, rallies hundreds of volunteers, raises thousands of dollars, and it was all a lie. It's a betrayal that hurts her and all those volunteers and donors who really wanted to help.
It's unbelievable. Sherri's case was everywhere, even getting mentioned in an Eminem song of all things.
Yeah, in his song Houdini, Eminem talks about the Sherri Papini hoax as an example of how easily people can be fooled by a well-told story. It's a reminder that we need to be more critical and question what we see and hear, especially with how fast news and social media can spread information these days.
It's true. It reminds us that sometimes those stories that sound too good to be true or too bad to be true, well, they often are.
You're right. We naturally gravitate towards stories that fit what we already believe or play on our fears and desires. But the Sherri Papini case is a warning reminding us to be careful about what we see on the surface and to look for the real truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
So we've got the timeline, the evidence, the fallout, but we haven't answered the biggest question, why? What could make someone do something like this? Was it attention, wanting to escape, or something completely different?
It's a question that keeps psychologists and criminologists up at night. And while there might not be one simple answer, we can look at some possible explanations using what experts say and what we learned from the documentary.
So we have this woman who seems to crave attention, has a history of making up stories, and might have been influenced by all the true crime stuff she was into. It's almost like she took pieces from different stories and made her own crazy narrative.
Right. It's a really complex mix of things. Even her own lawyer said she had chameleonic personalities, which basically means she needed validation and control. She changed who she was depending on the situation to get what she wanted.
That need for control is interesting.
Yeah.
The documentary makes it seem like Papini might have felt trapped in her marriage and her life, so maybe this kidnapping hoax was her way of getting some control back. Talk about a drastic way to change things up, though.
Yeah, no kidding. But the documentary also talks about her past. She had a rough childhood, a tough relationship with her parents. Trauma like that can really stick with you and change how you see the world and yourself.
So maybe it's a bit of both nature and nurture, like a perfect storm brewing inside her that led to this crazy thing.
Exactly. There's rarely just one reason why someone would make up something like this. But if we look at all the pieces, her past, her personality, and even how obsessed our culture is with true crime, we can start to understand how complicated the human mind can be.
This deep dive has been wild. We've got manipulation, lies, and the very real damage that comes from wanting attention so badly. But it also makes us think about some uncomfortable things, like why we're so fascinated by true crime and how easily we believe crazy stories. Are we too quick to believe what we see and hear without looking a little closer?
It's a good point. We need to be more careful about the information we take and question what we think we know, and remember that behind every big news story, there's a real human story that's usually way more complicated than we realize.
So, to wrap things up, here's something to think about. Could Sherri Papini's hoax have been stopped? Were there signs that people missed? And what can we learn from all of this to make sure that the resources and attention go to the people who really need it? It's a tough question, but it's an important one.
It really is. The Sherri Papini case shows us that even when things seem obvious, the truth can be hard to find. It's a case that will keep people fascinated and talking for years to come. It makes us question what we believe and how we see things.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's a reminder that sometimes the stories that grab us the most are the ones that make us rethink everything we thought we knew.